The Monkey's Paw by W. Jacobs. Part 1. Outside, the night was cold and wet. But in the small living room of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were closed and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were playing chess, with the father, who had ideas about the game involving unusual moves, putting his king in such dangerous positions that it even made the white-haired old lady knitting calmly by the fire comment. "Listen to the wind," said Mr. White, who, after noticing a mistake too late, was kindly trying to prevent his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said his son, seriously studying the board as he reached out his hand. "Check." "I don't think he'll come tonight," said his father, with his hand hovering over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst part about living so far out," yelled Mr. White suddenly. "Of all the terrible muddy and out-of-the-way places to live, this is the worst. The path is a bog, and the road is like a river. I don't know what people are thinking. I suppose because only 2 houses on the road are rented, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Maybe you'll win the next game." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to catch a knowing look between mother and son. The words died on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man got up quickly, and opening the door was heard sympathizing with the new arrival. The new arrival also sympathized with himself, so Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man with bright eyes and a red face. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands and, taking the offered seat by the fire, watched contentedly as his host got out whiskey and glasses and put a small copper kettle on the fire. After the 3rd glass, his eyes brightened, and he began to talk. The little family circle watched with eager interest as this visitor from distant lands squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of strange scenes and brave deeds, of wars, plagues, and strange people. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away, he was just a young man working in a warehouse. Now look at him. He doesn't look like he's been hurt much," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look around a bit, you know." "You're better off where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass, sighed softly, and shook it again.
"I'd like to see those old temples, fakirs, and jugglers," said the old man.
"What was that you were telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "At least, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, maybe," said the sergeant major casually. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host refilled it for him. "To look at," said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket, "it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and offered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son took it and examined it curiously. "And what's special about it?" asked Mr. White as he took it from his son, and after examining it, placed it on the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the sergeant major, "a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who tried to change it would be sorry. He put a spell on it, so that 3 different men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manner was so serious that his listeners felt their light laughter was out of place. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier looked at him the way middle-aged people often look at presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face turned pale. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anyone else wished?" inquired the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes, yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." His tone was so serious that a hush fell over the group. "If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. "If you could have another 3 wishes," said the old man, eyeing him keenly, "would you have them?" "I don't know," said the other. "I don't know." He took the paw and, dangling it between his front finger and thumb, suddenly threw it into the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier solemnly. "If you don't want it, Morris," said the old man, "give it to me." "I won't," said his friend stubbornly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Throw it on the fire again, like a sensible man." The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you use it?" he asked. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the sergeant major. "But I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like the Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. "Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, grabbed him by the arm. "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward, the 3 sat listening in an enthralled manner to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw isn't more truthful than the ones he's been telling us," said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, "we won't get much out of it." "Did you give him anything for it, Father?" asked Mrs. White, looking closely at her husband. "A trifle," he said, blushing slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he urged me again to throw it away." "Likely," said Herbert with fake horror. "Why, we're going to be rich, and famous, and happy. Wish to be an emperor, Father, to start with, then you can't be bossed around." He ran around the table, chased by Mrs. White, who had been insulted, armed with a small cushion. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it doubtfully. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact," he said slowly. "It seems to me I've got everything I want." "If you only paid off the house, you'd be completely happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. "Well, wish for 200 pounds then. That'll just do it." His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own gullibility, held up the talisman, as his son, with a solemn face somewhat spoiled by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and played a few impressive chords. "I wish for 200 pounds, said the old man clearly. A loud crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. "It moved," he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hands like a snake. "Well, I don't see the money," said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table, "and I bet I never will." "It must have been your imagination, father," said his wife, looking at him anxiously. He shook his head. "Never mind, though, there's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same." They sat down by the fire again while the two men finished their pipes. Outside the wind was louder than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence, unusual and depressing, settled over all three, which lasted until the old couple got up to go to bed. "I expect you'll find the money tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, as he wished them good night, "and something horrible sitting up on top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains." He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire, and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so ape-like that he stared at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he reached for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. Part 2. In the bright wintry sunlight the next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, Herbert laughed at his fears. The room had a normal, wholesome feel to it, which it hadn't had the night before, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was tossed carelessly on the sideboard, as if no one really believed in its powers. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea that we actually listened to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these times? And even if they were, how could 200 pounds hurt you, father?" "It might drop on his head from the sky," said the light-hearted Herbert. "Morris said the things happened so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you wanted to, say it was just a coincidence." "Well, don't spend the money before I come back," said Herbert, as he got up from the table. "I'm afraid it will turn you into a mean, greedy man, and we'll have to disown you." His mother laughed and followed him to the door, watching as he walked down the road. Then she returned to the breakfast table, feeling very happy at her husband's gullibility. But that didn't stop her from rushing to the door when the postman knocked, nor from speaking sharply about retired sergeant majors, with drinking habits, when she found that the post had only brought a bill from the tailor. "Herbert will probably have more funny remarks when he comes home," she said as they sat down to dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. I swear it did." "You imagined it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did," replied the old man. "It wasn't just my imagination. I had just— What's the matter?" His wife didn't reply. She was watching the strange movements of a man outside, who was looking at their house in a hesitant way, as if trying to make up his mind to come in. In her mind, thinking about the 200 pounds, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a shiny new silk hat. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand on the gate and then suddenly made up his mind, opened it, and walked up the path. At the same moment, Mrs. White quickly placed her hands behind her and hurriedly untied the strings of her apron, putting it under the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed uneasy, into the room. He looked at her furtively and listened absent-mindedly as the old lady apologized for the state of the room and for her husband's coat, which he usually wore in the garden. She then waited as patiently as she could for him to explain his business, but he was strangely silent at first. "I was asked to come," he said at last, and bent down to pick a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Ma and Megan's." The old lady started. "Is something wrong?" she asked breathlessly. "Has something happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband intervened. There, mother," he said quickly. "Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. I'm sure you haven't brought bad news, sir," he said, looking at the visitor hopefully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother. The visitor nodded. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that. Thank—" She suddenly stopped as the sinister meaning of his words dawned on her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the visitor's averted face. She gasped for breath and, turning to her slower-witted husband, placed her trembling old hand on his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at last, in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White in a dazed manner. "Yes." He sat staring blankly out of the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had done in their courting days nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The other man coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. "The firm wanted me to express their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss," he said, without turning around. "Please understand that I am only their messenger and am just following orders." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring and her breath barely audible. On the husband's face was a look like that of his friend the sergeant when he went into his first battle. "I was also told to say that Ma and Meggins accept no responsibility," continued the visitor. "They admit no liability at all, but in recognition of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, looked with horror at the visitor. His dry lips formed the words, "How much?" £200, was the answer. Unaware of his wife's scream, the old man smiled faintly, reached out his hands like a blind man, and collapsed in a heap on the floor. Part 3. In the large, new cemetery some 2 miles away, the old couple buried their son and returned to a house filled with shadows and silence. It all happened so quickly that at first they could hardly believe it, and they remained in a state of expectation, as though something else was going to happen. Something that would lighten the burden that was too heavy for their old hearts to bear. But the days passed and their expectation turned into resignation. The hopeless resignation of the elderly, sometimes mistaken for apathy. They rarely spoke to each other, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days dragged on in weariness. About a week later, the old man woke suddenly in the night, reached out his hand, and found himself alone. The room was dark, and the sound of quiet weeping came from the window. He sat up in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You'll be cold." "It's colder for my son," said the old woman, and began to cry again. The sound of her sobs faded in his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes were heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife woke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He jumped up in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You haven't destroyed it, have you?" "It's in the parlor, on the shelf," he replied, amazed. "Why?" She cried and laughed at the same time, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he asked. "The other 2 wishes," she replied quickly. "We've only used 1. "Wasn't that enough?" he asked fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll use 1 more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and threw off the blankets with trembling limbs. "Good God, you're mad!" he cried in shock. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish, oh, my boy, my boy!" Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you're saying." "The first wish was granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go and get it and wish," cried the old woman, shaking with excitement. The old man turned to look at her, and his voice shook. "He's been dead for 10 days, and besides, I wouldn't tell you this, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, what about now?" "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. "Do you think I'm afraid of the child I nursed?" He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor, then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him, before he could escape from the room, seized him, and he caught his breath as he realized he had lost his way to the door. With his forehead cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small hallway with the cursed thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed different when he entered the room. It was pale and expectant, and in his fear it seemed to have an unnatural look. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It's foolish and wicked," he hesitated. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he looked at it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled by the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle, which had burned down below the rim of the candlestick, was casting flickering shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with one last flicker, it went out. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief that the talisman had failed, crept back to bed. And a minute or two later, the old woman came silently and listlessly beside him. Neither of them spoke, but both lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was overwhelming, and after lying for some time trying to gather his courage, the husband took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out, and he paused to strike another. At the same moment, a knock, so quiet and stealthy that it was barely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, his breath held until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and quickly fled back to his room, closing the door behind him. A third knock echoed through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, sitting up. "A rat," said the old man in a trembling voice. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed, listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was ahead of her, and grabbing her by the arm held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy! It's Herbert!" she cried, struggling instinctively. "I forgot it's 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go! I must open the door!" "For God's sake, don't let it in!" cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son!" she cried, struggling. "Let me go! I'm coming, Herbert! I'm coming!" There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her desperately as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt slowly and stiffly drawn from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down, I can't reach it!" But her husband was on his hands and knees, frantically searching the floor for the paw. If he could only find it before whatever was outside got in. A series of loud knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it slowly slid back, and at that moment he found the monkey's paw and desperately made his third and final wish. The knocking suddenly stopped, though the echoes still lingered in the house. He heard the chair being pulled back and the door opening. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering across the road shone on a quiet and empty street.